CBS News can confirm documents with classified markings have been found in the Indiana home of former Vice President Mike Pence.
This, of course, follows the materials found at President Biden's home and former office. CBS News chief election and campaign correspondent Robert Costa, who recently sat down with former Vice President Pence, joins us now. So, Bob, let's just start off with a very basic question. What do we know?
We know that on Monday, January 16th, 2023, a longtime lawyer for former Vice President Mike Pence named Matt Morgan, who is based now in Indiana, lives near Pence's home in Carmel, Indiana, was called over to Pence's home to look through 4 boxes of vice presidential records. And during the course of that review, Matt Morgan saw documents marked as classified. When he saw these documents marked as classified, he put them in a safe and then alerted Greg Jacob, who was another Pence lawyer who was dispatched with dealing with the National Archives, and Jacob formally alerted the National Archives. This timeline is according to 2 people familiar with the discovery of these documents at Pence's home. The time period is notable because mid-January comes days after former Vice President Mike Pence sat down with CBS News in the Villages in Florida, where I asked him about whether he had any classified documents in his own vice presidential records. He said that when he left the White House in January of 2021, his team did a thorough review, and he believed his staff had ensured he did not have any classified documents in his possession. But it's then a few days later, after that interview in mid-January, he did ask his trusted lawyer, Matt Morgan, to go through those boxes at his home.
Robert Costa, I just want to listen because we do have the audio of that interview that you did with former Vice President Mike Pence. So let's take a listen and we'll keep chatting.
The Penn Biden papers are about vice presidential records. You are someone who has vice presidential records. Are you sure you have no classified material in your own archives?
Our staff reviewed all of the materials in our office and in our residence to ensure that there were no classified materials that left the White House or remained in our possession. And I remain confident that that was done in a thorough and careful way. Clearly, in the waning days of the Trump-Pence administration, that process was not properly executed by staff around the President of the United States. And look, as I said, I'm not diminishing the importance of protecting classified materials, particularly top secret materials. These are the nation's secrets. They bear upon our national security. But again, this issue to me is one of equal treatment under the law. And I just have to tell you, the double standard.
Well, those words have not aged well. He said he remained confident. Tell us, Bob, I mean, first of all, do you know how his team could have missed this? And what do you think his or his team's defense might be at this point?
As he noted, that during the final days of the Trump-Pence administration, it was chaotic. There was an insurrection at the United States Capitol, and clearly former President Trump took classified materials, documents marked as classified, back to his Florida residence, Mar-a-Lago. And Pence stated in the interview that he believed he did not bring anything back to Indiana. He flew back to Indiana right after the Biden inauguration on January 20th, took Air Force 2 back to Indiana, and he would travel with a lot of his trusted aides during that period. But the bigger picture here is that whether it's former Vice President Mike Pence or former President Donald Trump or President Joe Biden, the handling of classified materials by those in office, by those who formerly held high elected office, remains a variable in American political life. And as I sat down with Congressman Ro Khanna of California, a Democrat, yesterday, he believes that there's a new push now on Capitol Hill to pass legislation to more formalize this process of the handling of classified materials, especially as they pass between the principals like the vice president or president to national security staffers, perhaps to aides and lawyers in the West Wing and throughout other parts of the administration. Congressman Khanna and others have echoed him, have said that this process leaves a lot of gaps for people to bring documents home or to misplace documents or misfile documents.
Yeah, we certainly are seeing those gaps in the system playing out. Here are some of the things we don't know. We don't know the classification level of these documents. We heard the former vice president talk to you about the difference between top secret documents and the nation's secrets. We do know something, though, about the timeline. As you mentioned, you had just sat down with the former vice president, asked him these questions, and then he turned around and asked his staff to look for documents after assuring you, or feeling rather confident with you, Bob, that he didn't have anything. How is Pence's team responding now?
Pence's team is responding in a very limited way at this point, but we do see that the timing it really matters here to understand perhaps why did former Vice President Mike Pence ask his attorney, Matt Morgan, in Indiana to go to his house and look through these boxes, these 4 boxes of vice presidential records. Pence is someone who has just written a memoir, So Help Me God. He's been on a book tour for months. So he's been looking through his records, has some access to his records clearly over the past year. But during mid-January, the reason I was asking the former vice president about his handling of classified material, his own records, is because, of course, as CBS News has reported extensively, President Biden is now under scrutiny for documents he had at not only the Penn Biden Center, but at his Wilmington, Delaware home. And as the former vice president was asking Matt Morgan to go look at these boxes, that comes just as there was new information coming to light about documents at President Biden's home. So I never like to guess or assume anything as a reporter, but you can imagine that in that context, Pence may have said to himself, maybe it's worth double checking. And 2 people familiar with this discovery say that generally that was the case, that we were trying to learn more details about exactly why Morgan was asked to look through these documents. But it's clearly Pence wanted in some way to recheck these boxes inside his own home.
And how do you foresee this impacting former Vice President Pence moving forward, politically speaking?
President Trump, the former president, has issued a statement of support, which is interesting because Trump and Pence have, as we all know, clashed over January 6 and other matters since January 6, 2021. Pence is someone who's moving toward a 2024 presidential bid, but as he told me just a few weeks ago, he believes he does not need to make an imminent decision, that this process is going to play out, whether it's Pence or Florida Governor Ron DeSantis or Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin. So many potential Republican presidential contenders are saying to themselves, we don't need to rush in and have a fight one-on-one with former President Trump. They're looking at a timeline maybe later in the spring, early in the summer. It appears Pence is continuing to move ahead, and Republicans so far in Capitol Hill are not breaking with him in any way. I just sat down with Congressman Jim Banks, an influential conservative from Indiana, running for U.S. Senate now in 2024. I said, what do you think about this Pence story? Does it change your view of Pence? And he said, and he underscored it, that Pence to him is someone of the utmost integrity. So you see, for now, conservatives standing by the former vice president as this whole story plays out.
And it's interesting because in that interview that you had with him, Robert, he was talking about wanting equal treatment, and we saw that his response and President Biden's response was the same, to contact the National Archives, to hand those over, which is different from what we saw.
It was voluntary. It didn't require subpoenas or raids. Robert Costa, thank you so much.
Thanks, Robert.
Thank you.